Right, good evening, everyone. Excellencies, fellows of the AIIA, members of the AIIA, folks. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here today, or tonight rather, on behalf of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, of which I'm the CEO. And thank you, those of you in the room, for actually making it tonight. The weather is, the traffic is, and the weather is apparently terrible. So thanks for the effort. Here at the AIIA, you'll know that our first branches were founded in 1924, and we've been serving Australians for over a century, promoting an informed public debate on this nation's foreign relations. As a membership-based organisation, you too can join. With branches in every state and territory, we work tirelessly to provide forums like this one, where policymakers, scholars, business leaders, and members of the public can come together to explore Australia's place in the world. Today's event continues our tradition of bringing insightful voices to the fore at critical moments. It's also a significant year for us, with the second branch of the Institute in Victoria, or the second branch of the Institute in Victoria, to turn 100 after New South Wales last year. This marks another milestone in our long history of engagement with Australia's international affairs, and we welcome members online from those branches and also members attending around the country tonight. One of the valued figures who has contributed richly to our discussions in the past is our distinguished guest, former Senator, the Honourable Simon Birmingham. Simon has spoken a number of times at our, I think it's 2, right? Or is it 3 at our national conference? 3, I'm sorry, Simon. And now that he's speaking outside the constraints of his ministerial office, we might just try to persuade him to come back for a 4th time at some stage to the conference later, so that he can offer us an even broader perspective, as he will tonight, I'm sure. Tonight's topic could not be more timely. Simon will address trade issues, a subject thrown into sharp focus by the evolving tariff policies of the second Trump administration. Policies that are sending shockwaves across the globe among America's allies, its competitors, and even neutral parties. His insights also come at a critical juncture here at home, with the 2025 federal election less than a week away. Simon brings exceptional experience and understanding to the discussion. Over 18 years in the Senate and almost a decade as a government minister, he made substantial contributions across vital portfolios. As finance minister, Simon guided Australia's economic management through the pandemic and played a pivotal role in the creation of the AUKUS security partnership. As Trade Minister, he oversaw the negotiation of key free trade agreements, including the world's largest regional deal covering 15 Asia-Pacific economies, and adeptly managed Australia's responses to several global trade disruptions. His leadership in education, water policy, and his current roles as head of Asia-Pacific engagement and chairman for South Australia at ANZ ensure he brings an extraordinary breadth of policy expertise to today's discussion. Before we begin, I would like to pause and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. I'd also like to note that if you're following us online, you can come in with a question in the Q&A function at any time, and we might just read it out. So please type as soon as you can. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honourable Simon Birmingham.
Well, Bryce, as I lower the microphone from Bryce, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today to speak with the AIIA, both here in Canberra and to those who are streaming. Thank you very much for joining us as well. And Bryce, can I thank you for your engagement, courtesy, opportunities provided, and indeed strong, clear positions taken during my time as Minister and Shadow Minister and the work of AWA, its branches, and the benefit that that provides to debate around Australia. In a speech on trade policy in particular, I too acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and indeed all Australia's Indigenous peoples are first traders with the Makassar peoples, of course, many moons ago, and continuing contributors to our engagement, importantly, around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, and a particular, indeed, acknowledgement amongst the Excellencies to Canada's High Commissioner on a very notable day for Canadian democracy ahead of ourselves and Singapore in this big festival of democracy that is happening around the world at present. I want to go back a little. October 2018. It was a little over 18 months into Trump won and a little under 18 months before the biggest of the COVID disruptions were to come. And I was in Ottawa at the time, indeed, as it happens to be. I was in Ottawa for a minilateral of trade ministers. And whilst that meeting was taking place, I took a phone call from our then ambassador to the US, Joe Hockey. I was meant to be going from Ottawa on to DC. Joe said to me, "Bermo, have you heard about what happened with the New Zealand minister?" So I heard he came through DC on the way to Ottawa, Joe, and I gather it didn't go very well. He said, "Oh, well, he went to meet Bob Lighthizer, Trump 1's USTR, the US Trade Representative, and he went into that meeting and said, we're New Zealand, we're a great friend and partner, and we deserve the same exemptions on steel and aluminium as Australia's got." Lighthizer apparently basically took the New Zealander almost virtually by the scruff of the neck and said to the minister, Australia should have never got these damn exemptions, and there's no way no New Zealand's getting them either, and when I get my chance, Australia's not getting them. Australia's going to have them removed. Please come in. Joe said to me, "It's not a good time. My strong advice is you might want to have a family emergency and go straight from Ottawa back to Australia. Because the last thing, having got the exemption that we need, is to be on the radar." Family emergency ensued. DFAT changed the flights, and I made my way back to some kids who were happy to see me a few days early. But I tell this story because it provides some insight into the diplomatic minefield that dealing with even the first Trump administration was. And at this stage, that looks like a piece of cake relative to Trump too. What had brought us to Ottawa at the time was what was to be the beginning of a partial unravelling, as we're now seeing, of the rules-based liberal global trading system that underpins globalisation. Trump won. Donald Trump had joined with Hillary Clinton during the 2016 presidential campaign to take and to pull the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was a bipartisan position in that campaign, it shouldn't be forgotten. This decision may forever be marked as the moment that the US ceded an advantage on rules making and supply chain integration. Trump won, then following election also invoked or abused national security and emergency powers to apply tariffs on steel and aluminium, while also initiating the first incarnation of the erratic trade war with China. And Trump 1 effectively disabled the dispute resolution function of the World Trade Organization by blocking appointment of members to its appellate body. Like-minded trade ministers of liberal democratic countries who valued a rules-based trading system came together in what we would then call the Ottawa Group, an example of minilateralism or plurilateralism at work. And I have a little more to say on the Ottawa Group later and the example it provided. But first, we should frame the environment, look beyond Trump. What is it that enables his assault on free trade, and how is it analogous to other challenges to an open trading system? Now, for committed free traders like me, it's easy to be convinced by the evidence that free trade works and delivers benefits far beyond pure economics. People live longer, healthier, better lives, thanks in part to global economic liberalisation. In protectionist post-war 1950, global child mortality stood at 27%, but by 2020 was just 4.3%. Contrary to perceptions of many, extreme poverty in our world has declined. 200 years ago, in a global population of about 1 billion people, close to 90%, or 900 million of those 1 billion, lived in extreme poverty. Since then, our population, of course, has multiplied to exceed 8 billion, but the number in extreme poverty has actually declined to an estimated around 700 million, inverse the 90-10 ratio of 2 centuries ago. If you were alive back then, there was a 9 in 10 chance that you wouldn't be able to read. Around the world now, 8 in 10 people are literate. And yes, of course, penicillin, vaccinations, electricity, refrigeration, contraceptives, the internal combustion engine, the printing press, and so many other advances are behind these improvements in humankind. But underpinning this innovation, entrepreneurialism, and investment has been a global system enabling the freer movement of capital, of knowledge, of goods and services that have transformed those lives and delivered those benefits. And nowhere in the last 50 years have these gains been more evident than in our region, the Asian region, where many hundreds of millions have been lifted out of poverty. For Australia, directly, this has helped deliver what the economists described as a miracle economy. With COVID aside, 30 plus years of continuous economic growth. So why, in a world where global trade winds have delivered such benefits, is the global trading system now encountering such headwinds? There are 3 areas that I see to have clearly eroded support for free trade in a variety of different ways and places. Firstly, dislocation in segments of advanced economies, especially those regions that have come to depend upon traditional manufacturing industries. Secondly, a lack of advancement in segments of less developed economies that fuels resentment across parts of the global south. And finally, the challenge of pricing in externalities in trade flows, which has particularly become more accentuated via debates on climate policy, but has also long been applicable in areas of labour rights and other aspects of environmental standards. Now, it can well be argued that these problems are not a cause of free trade itself, but of numerous other policy failures. The so-called Rust Belt states of the United States, who are seen as emblematic of the dislocation in advanced economies and, of course, are the places fueling much of the Trumpian policies, they've been let down by a failure to apply the types of social safety nets or adaptive industry policies that have spared other places, like in our own country, my home state of South Australia, a traditional manufacturing state, have spared us the same degree of pain from the economic transition that has occurred as those old industries have moved elsewhere. Equally, the countries in the global south, who most complain about a lack of advancement, are often the same countries who have been the slowest to open up to investment, the least stable, the most corrupt, and are often largely blame shifting from their own policy failures to globalisation. The third area of externalities features views, though, that are strongly held in markets such as Europe and does raise a range of ethical or values judgments inherent, of course, in many economic trade-offs. So while Trumpian tariff policies are a reaction to one set of concerns, other countries, like South Africa, have frequently stymied WTO reforms or initiatives in response to their perceptions of the second set of concerns, while a third set of increasingly complicated demands in negotiations from fisheries policy to e-commerce. So what is a country like Australia to do in response to the disruption that we face, especially, of course, the current disruption from the US? In response to President Trump's initial March 12 application of tariffs on steel and aluminium, I wrote at the time that Australia should apply the old maxim of don't get angry, don't get even, get ahead. The importance of keeping a level head has only become more important for a country like Australia in the face of the on-again, off-again nature of the reciprocal tariffs, retaliatory tariff strikes, the wild market gyrations and talk of global recession or stagflation. It is imperative that Australia applies responses with that calm and level head that safeguard both our economic and security circumstances. Firstly, we've got to keep perspective in the bilateral relationship, particularly the bilateral trade relationship. The US accounts for less than 5% of Australian exports, less than what we export to China, of course, but also to Japan, South Korea or India. It matters, especially if you're an Australian beef exporter, but the 10% Australian tariff is more an irritating breach of faith than a dagger to our economic heart. In contrast, the US has long been our number one source of foreign direct investment and is also the number one destination for outbound Australian investment. Through 2023, two-way investment between Australia and the US was valued at over $1.8 trillion. This relationship is fundamental, not just for the capital inflows that it creates, but also for technology transfer, innovation and job creation. Two-way investment flows with the US are a far more critical pillar in Australia's economic strength than are our trade flows with the US. Likewise, the security alliance between Australia and the US has been a cornerstone of our foreign policy for decades. Leaders clearly have been at pains to not allow disappointment over the US tariffs to infect our close defence and security cooperation. On this front, I would give credit to the discipline being shown in the current Australian election campaign to largely avoid an overly aggressive response to these provocative US trade policy actions. Unquestionably, to overreact to the 10% tariff on Australia would itself be an act of potential self-harm. Australia's defence and security leadership rightly have worked hard to ensure that our security relationship remains robust and unshaken. This means continuing to engage in joint military exercises, intelligence sharing and diplomatic dialogues like the Quad that reinforce our mutual commitment to regional stability. Rightly or wrongly, President Trump and his key officials see these tariffs through the lens of bolstering American economic strength, especially in manufacturing and agriculture, as well as providing a revenue source to help fund their planned income and company tax cuts. But they see this strength from a US perspective as an important counter to China. And that is precisely the same attitude that sees them still continue to support the security relationship with Australia, including AUKUS. In times of this disruption in US engagement around the world, we remain better placed than many for a stability and continuity in at least our alliance and engagement. And this hard power military cooperation with the US, along with shared strategic interests, does continue to provide Australia with opportunities to exercise influence. Influence not just in that military engagement, but also in other aspects of policy that over time may help to mitigate not just the economic policies or the tariff barriers, but also the approach to other partners around the world. While preserving our investment and security ties with the US is important, we should equally, though, seize on the global concern that these actions have taken about trade flows to prove the Trump administration wrong about its trade policies. In the spirit of never wasting a crisis, now is the time for Australia to lean into the rest of the global trading system and play a greater leadership role. We have done so before, we can and should do so again. Firstly, as I said, we must continue to avoid reactionary measures. Retaliation may seem like a fitting immediate response to some, but there's no benefit in making a bad situation or bad policy even worse. But we should vigorously pursue opportunities to broaden our free trade networks. The political consensus in support of free trade in Australia exists because of quite a remarkable public underpinning of that consensus. As the Lowy Institute polling research shows, a remarkable 80% of Australians understand and agree that free trade is beneficial to their standard of living. If anything, that Trumpian approach is hardening support in Australia for global cooperation with other countries. And opportunities to do so do exist. And we should strike while the US has created the mood to do so, by pursuing the previously elusive deals with the European Union and with India. We should also aspire to broaden membership of the big multi-party agreements like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement or the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Thank you, Canada, for taking the TPP and making it so much harder to say. Numerous economies, despite the extra 2 letters, have been lining up, or maybe because of them, to join the CPTPP. And while standards in the CPTPP must be upheld, because it is the most ambitious of such agreements, imagine the powerful symbolism. Were the TPP able to see both China and Taiwan as 2 economies successfully progress through ascension into the CPTPP? There is also scope to look at what our existing trade agreements cover, not just who they are with. The Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement provides an example of digital trade reforms that can streamline processes and reduce bureaucratic hurdles to trade. By digitising more trade documentation and customs procedures, we can boost productivity and lower costs to trade. Finally, in terms of the trade reform agenda that Australia can lead, the World Trade Organisation may now be perceived as an entity for which life support was just switched off. But a trade-saving triple bypass could still be possible, and Australia could play a leading role as we have in multilateral institutions before. The US may have abandoned all pretense of respect for the WTO, but we have worked with other partners to demonstrate how, even in the face of US disruption, we can work with a coalition of the willing to preserve a rules-based trading system. I promise to come back to the Ottawa Group and its work, and indeed significant outcome of its work was the 2020 Plurilateral Agreement establishing the Multi-Party Interim Appeal Arbitration Agreement, another catchy title. Effectively, it's a workaround to the US obstruction of traditional WTO dispute settlement mechanisms. Initially from those Liberal Democratic partners who gathered at that first meeting in Ottawa, but ultimately joined by a number of other countries. In fact, proof of its success was that it was this mechanism that enabled the resolution of 3 of the extremely sensitive WTO disputes between Australia and China. Because after that work between those liberal democracies who started the process, China ultimately joined on to that appellate body replacement mechanism as well. And it's a model of cooperation between others to uphold a rules-based system, to advance negotiations, to demonstrate what could and should be done that should be replicated by others. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, has wisely suggested that perhaps CPTPP member states could work with EU member states to try to break new ground on how to save and preserve aspects of the global trading system. I would add that perhaps we should look at whether the RCEP member states could be included in such thinking too, so as to ensure critically that all of the ASEAN nations have the opportunity to be at the table. Members of the largest trade pacts in the world, 3 of the largest, biggest trade pacts that exist, with some overlap in membership, could give momentum to real reforms to address some of the trade concerns that are held throughout the world. US gripes about the WTO are not all unfounded, but trying to get momentum to address them has been the challenge. Perhaps this can be the opportunity to prove it can be done, as well as to prove the benefits of that openness. Critical as we do all of this, though, is to ensure that we are also preserving, standing up for as Australia, the interests of our many Asian and Pacific partners. Relative to Australia, if the reciprocal tariffs are to proceed, they have been far harder hit by President Trump's trade decisions. The great disruptor to global markets and economies is the risk of tit-for-tat actions, as we've seen continuing between the US and China. 20% lurched to 34%, saw another 50% entering almost farcical territory. But it does seem that there is perhaps a glimmer of hope that the reaction of bond markets, that economic policy could just be signalling at least a desire for stabilisation and the creation of some off-ramps. However, there is the big reciprocal tariff decision to come, and compared with Australia's 10%, the 24%, 26% and 32% tariffs applied respectively for Japan, South Korea and Taiwan are of far greater consequence for these North Asian economies who have much higher levels of trade dependency on the US. And for some of those less prosperous economies across our region, but increasingly trade-reliant Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam facing a 46% tariff, Indonesia 32%, Thailand 37% or Cambodia 49%, the impact could be profound. Even in our Pacific Island family, partners like Fiji facing 32% would be aghast at the hit on their very limited goods exports, especially as it comes alongside cuts in aspects of development assistance as well. Alongside the overall shocks to the global economy, it's the impacts of these US decisions on their relations with these partners that may prove to be the greatest consequence of these tariff decisions. US leadership in the Asia-Pacific region and across the Indo-Pacific has long been pivotal for maintaining a balance of power, for investing in economic growth, and in some cases for promoting democratic values. For 30 to 40 years, the combination of US security and US investment worked alongside China's economic reforms to deliver many of the life-changing dividends this region has benefited from. Rather than using too much of our capital in Washington seeking to just reduce the 10% tariffs applied to Australia, it's arguably of greater strategic importance and interest for us to advocate for a reduction of the higher tariffs applied to regional partners, such as Vietnam or Indonesia. Australian interests are served by the US remaining engaged in our region, which logically requires the US to remain welcome in our region. Unless the President is quickly encouraged to secure some of his much vaunted deals with these countries, the tariffs could see the welcome mat put out less often as these policies decrease both popular and political support for engagement with the US. So there are big challenges for Australia, but big opportunities for us to get ahead of such globally disruptive policies. There is also the biggest threat that we face dependent upon how they play out. In my analysis, that threat is the wedge. The wedge potentially played by either of the two largest economies. And we've seen each potentially dangle it out there in different ways. China demanding that Australia sign on to a global approach against the US initiative. The US, in parts, suggesting that countries encouraged by Mexico in some deliberations at least, could, to get a better deal with America, consider their own application of tariffs against China. Whilst that may make sense for those with regional proximity to the US, it would be a devastating situation for Australia to be put in that type of wedge scenario. Thus far, perhaps it looks like the worst could be avoided if we see a continuance of the last week or two, where it seems that the signals point to a calmer approach. If that's the case, then calm, cool heads in Australia can and should ensure that our response can be strategic, forward-looking, protect our key equities, those investment and security equities, focus on our productivity, ensure Australia is resilient, but use this as a chance to reactivate our diplomacy, particularly in trade and economic security around the world, and to prove that a collaborative approach is more beneficial than a destructive one. Thanks again for the chance to be here tonight, and I look forward to the questions coming from online, in the room, or elsewhere across trade, and no doubt I'm sure we'll touch on a couple of other matters too.
All right, thank you so much. I'm sure at some stage the High Commissioner Julie Sunday will explain why those two letters were necessary. In the meantime, though, we do have an online question, and it's from our good friend Zara Kimpton, the Vice President of the AIIA, who I'm sure is going to kill me for getting the number of times you turned up to the national conference wrong, Simon. But she asks, if the Chinese government is unable to stimulate internal demand for its goods, do you think that China will be able to find alternative markets without dumping products into other countries, which will lead to disruption in some regions, as has happened in America? Or do you think that in Australia we will benefit from products that will now be exported here at cheaper prices than before? A detailed question, as always, from Zara.
It is indeed, Bryce. I don't think there are particular measures that China is going to be able to take in the immediate or short term that will suddenly stimulate their domestic demand. China's been trying to grow its domestic demand for some time, and whilst before the latest trade disruptions, there were perhaps some glimmers of a little bit of a lift in terms of some analyst predictions around China's economic growth. That was by no means suggesting there was the type of surge or sustained lift in domestic demand, given pressures in their housing sector and other concerns across their economy. So I think the greater likelihood is, if we are to see consequences, the latter. Now, what goods could or would be dumped on an Australian economy that might either be of concern or benefit? Well, in many ways, it is potentially the already relatively low-priced, fast-moving consumer goods that will struggle to find their way at higher price points into the US. They're also goods for which I suspect many businesses will find the ability to adjust their production volumes in China relatively quickly. That is, of course, of detriment potentially to China's economy, in terms of what it means for those production volumes and further employment pressures that particularly apply there. So that will beg the question as to what else might China's leaders do, if not able to stimulate domestic demand in a consumer demand sense. Then we come back to some of those other policy settings long applied by China in terms of how they might stimulate other parts of their industrial base, made more challenging by having the type of pressures in the housing market already evident there. But I would expect to see that if it is manifesting itself, then the need to respond for Chinese leadership will be real, and that they will look to some type of stimulus eventually.
Very good. amplification in the room, I guess, but we can all hear each other. But make sure you do speak into the microphone because there are folks at home who want to hear what you have to say. Could you also stand and state your name and any affiliation you might have?
My name is Rosemary Ganley, and I come from Defence, and it's wonderful to be a member here as well. My question is, what I'd like to see is Australia demonstrate to the US that we have other trade partners and we have a wider ability, and so maybe trade with them is not so amazing. So why can't we trade with Europe? What is the hang up? Is it the French farmer? Is it really? Or is there some other basic reason why we can't organise a trade deal with Europe?
Well, if we were looking to do trade deals with each of the 26 countries with Europe, we'd probably comfortably get to 20 odd. It's always getting the consensus that is the challenge. And indeed, spoke about WTO reform. What's the great difficulty in actually achieving and realising WTO reform? Consensus. Consensus interpreted as unanimous agreement across all parties on everything. And getting through trade agreement with the EU faces that hurdle of the Europeans needing to get that consensus across their member states. And so, it is in some ways as simple as French farmers. I would say at this point in time, if the EU can't see the important symbolism of doing a deal right now, at the same time as Australia seeing the important symbolism of doing a deal, and the world seeing the importance of creating that symbolism, then there's probably no hope of a deal ever being struck. So I hope that when we leave caretaker mode, and knowing that the EU had their elections last year, so you get one of those rare windows with no elections coming up in either system, that there might just be the momentum, that perhaps the concerns over breakdown in some of our relations with France, coupled with the historic concerns in the agriculture sectors, might be able to be put to one side. It still has to end up being a deal worth doing, is the point that I would stress, though. Symbolism matters, and that would be great, but the deal shouldn't just be done and compromised for symbolism. It would be a mistake for either party, whoever gets to form government next week, to basically go back to what Minister Farrell walked away from and say, oh, well, it matters more now, so we'll do that deal. If it wasn't good enough then, it's still not good enough today, because you can have all of the symbolism in the world. These agreements also do need to actually provide for the functional benefit of liberalising the flow of goods and services to be worthwhile doing. And Australia's got to make some difficult decisions on the way there. When I was Trade Minister, we started the process of consultations around geographical indications. I won't give people a long and tortuous lecture on the history of geographical indications, but it's safe to say that the dairy industry and some of my National Party colleagues were not too thrilled with me at the time, but it was a recognition. We'll have to give something there if we expect our red meat producers to get something in return. That's a recognition of the trade-offs, but we've all got to be willing to move properly in those domains.
Okay, I'll go back online now, and I'm going to Manuela Fernandez de Cordova, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Ecuador. And she's, of course, plugging for South America and asking if there's a chance for Australia to look to the other side of the Pacific. Latin America can be an interesting partner for Australia. She notes that Latin America is increasing its participation with CPTPP, And maybe it's time for Australia to embrace what Latin America has to offer. I wonder if Manuela doesn't mind that I expand that out. Is it time, or is this a unique opportunity to explore trade relationships with partners that Australia hasn't really had a deep relationship with? I mean, you've mentioned already traditional partners and our own, the word is not correct, but backyard in terms of who we should be looking to encourage. But are there other opportunities that we may not have looked at in the past and we now may take up?
Bryce and Manuela, thank you for the question. There's always scope for diversification, but we should also understand markets will always seek to find the right economic place to land. Now, of course, if trade barriers are put up to the extent that that in a US-China dispute is being proposed, those walls create real barriers, and therefore markets will have to find other directions. Ideally, optimally, of course, we would be liberalising as much as we can, and by all means, in the pursuit of expansion of CPTPP, expand into South America, create those avenues of opportunity. When we had our trade dispute with China and Australian barley was tariffed, one of the first pivots made was to see the first shipment of Australian barley land in Mexico. And it landed in Mexico under the CPTPP, which had provided for the first trade agreement between Australia and Mexico. So sometimes when the walls go up somewhere, it's then about the fact that the market opening occurs elsewhere. More easily so, of course, for a commodity like barley that can ship and move in a commoditized market around the world than, for example, during that dispute, our wine industry struggling more with branded content where it is harder to get the brand sale quickly in other markets where you haven't established those brands. So yeah, yes, we should look to pursue. And I think there's a role, I put a framework on top of Christopher Luxem's idea in terms of what indeed the CPTPP and EU and RCEP member states could do. You could argue there's a place as to, could all of the OECD member states, with of course one large exception in the current circumstance, work together to pursue an opening up, which does bring in a number of the liberal democracies and more advanced economies across South America. So there's definitely opportunities there, but I always put the caveat on those in terms of just the economic realism about where the markets truly do exist. And ultimately, I said this during the China trade conflict, for countries in our region, China is the largest trading partner in most part because it's the largest economy in our region. If you're in the Americas, the US is most commonly the largest trading partner because it's the biggest economy. If you're in Europe, quite often it'll be Germany who's your largest trading partner. This is a consequence of size and scale and reality. It's why people look so enthusiastically to India, because the size and scale means that for smaller economies, the opportunity is so much bigger. And so we need to be mindful of that and the fact that business will seek those economies of scale and those commercial opportunities where they get the best bang for their buck. But for governments, creating the maximum choice, as indeed the Mexico example I gave before indicates, means that business and markets can adapt to the unpredictable times we live in.
Yeah, Andreas Radke, I'm representing the German Friedrich Ebert Foundation, but don't worry, I'm not going to ask about Nuremberg sausages or anything. Rather, I'd really like to thank you for holding up the flag of, saving the furniture of a multilateral system or the rules that we have been relying on for such a long time, because more often than not, at least in my observation, the Australian reaction to Trumpian disruption has been looking at the transactional options that are out there. And of course, that was maybe amplified a little bit by the ongoing campaign. I'm going to follow that on with a naughty question, like what would be a good election outcome to make what you propose possible? Because you've been speaking of wedges, and wedges are quite common also in Australian domestic politics. And of course, there's a huge risk that any incoming government will be under a lot of pressure to deliver on a transactional front in the relationship with the United States, rather than pursuing that multilateral and more strategic approach that you have just been sort of barracking for. So what would be a good election outcome? But you can choose to answer in a different way if you like.
Well, I'll answer it in at least two parts. So for dealing with the US and the Trump administration, a clear outcome will be a good outcome, no matter the side. And I say that because President Trump likes winners. And so in an Australian context, when were we at our strongest in dealing with Trump? Initially, due to strong positions taken by Malcolm Turnbull and strong relationships built by Joe Hockey, and that worked well. Then we faced some pressure points. Then when Scott Morrison unexpectedly won in 2019, and Trump had clearly been briefed and told, don't expect this guy to be around for long, he was quite interested in the winner and wanted to forge a close relationship that could be seen there. So I think there is an opportunity post this election where if the PM wins, and it's perhaps in a context where people thought that that was doubtful a few months ago, then he may well be in a strong position as an unexpected winner. If Peter wins, and against a scenario where right now people don't think that's likely, he may well be in a strong position. And then in a sense, a clear win is good for the country in terms of dealing with Trump and the potential to then get on the front foot. With the rest of the world, it will require perhaps elements of the ambition to look at the problem beyond the binary. And that will be a test for either side, particularly to go beyond the obvious bits. The obvious bit is to try to get the EU deal done, and that's been talked about. The obvious bit is to try to make sure that the ambitions to upgrade the India agreement into a proper agreement are realised. Doesn't mean it's easy in either of those cases, but the obvious things to do. The harder bits are indeed what you do with the multilateral system and how you underpin that. And I've kept the remarks to trade policy tonight because that's what I know a bit more about. But we face those challenges writ large in a few other ways too, particularly in relation to the World Health Organization, which is perhaps more acute in terms of what it means for Pacific Island nations, less impacted by the WTO, more dependent largely. We've always prided the fact that Australian ODA is the largest contributor to those Pacific Island nations. By default, that means that the US is not as significant. So US aid cuts matter, but don't matter as much there as they matter in other parts of the world where the US has been the biggest provider of aid. But what I am picking up is certainly that possible significant cuts into WHO programs could have repercussions into those Pacific Island countries, no doubt into PNG and elsewhere in our region. So how we also make sure that we are working in that advocacy piece that I said before, that whoever wins has got to be willing to go into DC and not just say the deal for Australia matters. It's actually the region that matters. And that's kind of, that is understood across large parts of Congress and across large bipartisan swathes of Congress. Got to make sure it's understood into the administration as well, that actually those areas of engagement in terms of those health programs that type of cooperation, continuing to take Fiji water as an export good from Fiji. These things matter when it comes to those relations. And so I think there is essentially the direct bipartisan piece, the advocacy piece, and then the work on the broader multilateral system. And that last piece is going to require a real sense of ambition and willing to engage around the region. And in a campaign where, as we kind of commented on the way in, we haven't heard a lot about foreign policy on the whole, aside from the reactions to Trump, well, that's going to be the real test as to who's going to frame out that broader agenda to work with partners, to hook in with those from New Zealand, Canada, but within the Asian region and partners across the rest of the world, be they from South America to Europe, who are willing to step forward in those regards.
Anyone else?
Sure. Michael from ANU, thanks for your speech. My question was in relation to, you made the comment I found very interesting about level-head decision-making and consideration. In a political environment where some of our decisions or pronouncements and utterances are less considered and statements more about virility online and on social media, how do we make sure that we're bringing it back to a policy focus, considered, well thought out structure when we discuss public policy, foreign defence, trade, in our media and political space? Thank you.
If I had the perfect answer to that question, Michael, I might still be there. But thank you. Look, it is in some ways the big question of our time. The trends we are facing, and if the polls are to be believed, we will see another election in Australia in which the two traditional parties receive some of the lowest primary votes in their history, and a further fracturing of that support here, as we are seeing that fracturing occur in many places around the world. It's not a perfectly linear trajectory. Indeed, to continue a Canadian focus, we can see there that there was a bit of a return at a point of crisis to the two major parties. So faced with enough concern, enough worry about any type of circumstance, you'll get that swing and that movement back. But look around the globe and you certainly see that fracturing. And the fracturing is in part a system that we should never have thought was going to kind of stay the same forever. Nothing gives two political parties a monopoly on permanently being the biggest two in a democracy. But what is certainly driving it is a change, and a significant change in media consumption. And the fact that people no longer receive news and information through a carefully curated, editorialized media landscape that was largely a select number of television stations, a handful of radio stations, and a few newspapers, who may have had their own different attitudes or approaches, but on the whole were largely meeting some type of journalistic and ethical standards. Instead, they now get it from a variety of sources and no sources at all. And the algorithms that drive news and information reinforce prejudices and reinforce content biases, and mean the more you look at something, the more it's fed to you. And that is feeding a lot of that fracturing and makes it so much harder to have bigger, more detailed policy discussions. So it is a challenge for democracies around the world. Could have had a whole different discussion on that, on what it means in terms of autocratic threats, how it is used in different ways. The reassuring part, in a sense, is that we come through another election campaign in Australia, touch wood, a few days to go, and the sense of major interference or the like doesn't seem to be there. Our democracy appears to still be resilient to those types of external threats from nation-state actors, and long may we ensure that our institutions have that resilience. But in terms of resilience to the changing way in which people consume and receive information, that is something that is very cultural, and it's very hard to make sure that the education and the understanding and the need to trust and verify content sources is sufficiently embedded in your culture to stymie that. So I think we continue with a rough period ahead in terms of how you actually make sure that the debates are at the type of level that an AIIA membership would logically wish them to be at.
Well done. Okay, very good. I have a final question, if I may, and I hope I'm not going to be telling this wrong, but you did once when we bumped into each other in Prague or something, tell me an anecdote about your dealings with the Trump administration when you were on the trade team. And I'm fairly certain I've seen this in print as well, that you've written it. So I hope I'm not, disclosing information that you had one goal when you were talking to Trump himself, and that was to put in front of him information about Australia's the deficit that we had with Trump. If you had one message to give to Trump now from Australia, what would you give to him, and how would you deliver it?
Thanks, Bryce. And it is a good test, and yes, it does go to 2019 Osaka G20 meeting when Trump, to my comment about winners, had decided that on the margins of the G20 he wanted to have dinner with Scott Morrison, and then the day before PM was due to depart for that, we got word that Trump was also taking Lighthizer, who I mentioned before, and Peter Navarro, whose name has become somewhat more globally recognised in recent times. And so the call came through to me to sort of, I was literally, I think, on a flight from Brisbane back to Adelaide, and the call came through to say, Burma, I think you need to be in Sydney to be on the PM's plane tomorrow morning to join him for this event. And we then workshopped a bunch of different things, which included about 5 different slides I took there, only one I used, which was to, when the discussion went down I'm very worried about our trade deficit. So, Mr. President, there isn't a trade deficit. Well, I've been told there is. Well, may I please? What would I do now, and how would I do it? I think right now the message, to be consistent with what I've said, is more acutely the region matters and partners across the region matter. How would I synthesize that into the one simple picture, slide, or otherwise? I need to play around with it a little bit, but I think something that demonstrates the extent of trade and investment reliance growing with China and already in decline with the US from a number of the key countries in this region could be a powerful way to argue you need to reverse, not worsen, that decline.
Great, thank you, Simon.
Okay, was it on the spot one?
Yeah. Thank you. All right, thanks. Thanks, Simon. I think it's a pity that you're not in politics anymore, but I'm sure you're a credit to the new world that you inhabit. And we, as I said, would love to see you back at some time. What are you doing in November? I hope. Yeah.
You could tell Zara that Heather has already asked.
Oh, Heather's already asked. Great. Thanks, Heather. Okay, thank you, folks. As you know, we do have quite a packed schedule coming up, so please do join up as a member of the AIIA to enjoy the full benefits of the organisation. And note that tomorrow we have Jen Parker coming in to talk about Australia's maritime security. Our ACT branch the following day has an event on the Pacific with James Bately, I think. And then we have a number of events going forward, including Alan Tidwell, who's the head of Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Studies at Georgetown University, is coming in to speak on the Pacific as well. We have John Blaxland, who is the representative of the ANU in Washington, who will come and talk to us about From the Bubble to the Swamp and Back. And very soon we'll be advertising also for Paul Midford, who's a fairly renowned scholar of Japanese politics and international relations, and he's going to be talking about the Senkaku problem, the Senkaku Islands. On the way, I forgot to mention Claire York, who's going to be talking about whether or not this is the end of the age of empathy in politics. But for now, I would very much like to thank Simon Birmingham for his contribution tonight. We normally give this book, Australia and World Affairs, which is available for sale out in the foyer or at any good bookstore, to our speakers. But I was sort of sitting here looking at this today thinking, actually, Simon probably lived through most of this stuff. Nevertheless, it's a good memoir. So thank you very much, Simon, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.